Last week, forces from India and China clashed on a disputed Himalayan border. We're going to discuss what happened because 20 Indian soldiers were killed and an unknown number of Chinese troops were also killed. Why did this happen in the first place? What's the history between these two nations in that region? And we're going to talk about a lot more than that on this episode of the Tonic Accord. All right, guys, let's get into this. So last week, there was a clash between the Indian and Chinese forces. I'm joined once again by my friend and co-host Alex to talk about this. Alex, how you doing?
I'm not doing bad. Week 2 of my self-quarantine. I can almost get out and do stuff again. So other than that, all is good, man.
Well, good. Hope you're staying safe and healthy. In the other side of the world, probably the exact opposite side of the world, there's been a kind of an increase in tensions. So I'm going to say a lot of foreign words to me, so forgive me if I butcher them. But a clash broke out between Indian and Chinese forces in the Galwan Valley of the Aksai Chin area of the Himalayan mountains, right? This is an area that is kind of disputed between a couple nations. India kind of claims ownership of this area. China claims ownership of the area. Not far off, there's a disputed area between India and Pakistan and Nepal. It's kind of tucked right in between all of this as well. So there's kind of a lot of conflict over who dominates and who owns this area to begin with, and we'll kind of get into a history as to why. But the news headline that you've probably seen is a clash between these two troops, including the killing of 20 Indian soldiers. The Chinese soldiers involved in the fight were reported to use iron rods and batons with spikes. Kind of absolutely crazy to hear. So it was a hand-to-hand combat battle. China has not said anything about the losses on their end, but I have to imagine that it's not zero. So in response, a lot of Indian people have done things like delete TikTok, which is a Chinese-owned app, as well as just burn their phones, Huawei phones. And it's caused a lot of interesting responses from Modi, and we'll kind of get into that. But what are your just kind of like first responses from this? What's kind of like your first response?
Well, this part of the world, Central Asia in specific, is a very complicated place when you're dealing with borders. Right? Like we had China just in the last century absorb Tibet. We had imperialism between Pakistan and India with Britain. And we've just had so many changing borders that, to be completely blunt, it's very difficult to know which country you're in, especially in these places that you mentioned. And what I take out of this is that China was looking for a fight there. And the reason why I say that is because there's a lot of criticisms, and so Al Jazeera and The Economist both mentioned this, that China's been concerned about the U.S. buddying up with India.
Right.
And also, India does lay claim to obviously this disputed border. And also this border region is a very important asset for Chinese growth and infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so I see this as an economic geopolitical problem. And just another takeaway is that why the hell were they using bats with spikes? Like,
very strange.
Are we going back to the imperial India? Like, I just don't understand. Like, I know they're in a rural part of the country, and not to make light of it, but couldn't they afford machine guns? I don't know. It's just some weird stuff. And I'm going to just go out on a limb and say that more Chinese people were killed just because China hasn't been upfront about the numbers. And I don't know. It's just a feeling I have. Obviously, there's no proof of that. But yeah, just my takeaway is I think this is actually going to be almost good for India in some ways, is because India is very reliant on China for a lot of their things from tech. For example, let me see. I have it here. In 2019, I think China was responsible for close to 30% of their tech. Like you mentioned, they're talking about burning Huawei phones, things like this. And so for a long time, India has been kind of a potential backup for foreign direct investment. A lot of U.S. and Western companies have been looking at other places to put their businesses and their factories other than China. And after the trade war, Vietnam and India have been potential spots.
Right.
And so this could actually be an interesting thing that could be actually, in my opinion, good for geopolitics and good for geoeconomics. And we could see now India is still a pretty backwards country when it comes to a lot of their laws involving workers' rights, foreign direct investment. But this could be a time that we see internal reform inside of India and also maybe better spots for the US and other corporations to put their direct investment.
That's a really interesting take. Again, you mentioned that, China is India's largest trading partner, but there's kind of an imbalance, right? Same thing that Trump has been talking about for years, how there's an imbalance in the trade partnership that favors China. And in India's case, a lot of people argue it heavily favors China. So to have this conflict break out, and to have now calls for maybe switching supply lines or not buying Chinese goods, it does have a larger, geopolitical and economic effect. Do I think World War III is going to start? No, I don't think so. I think obviously both nations. One is we have to remember both nations are nuclear armed, right? These are nuclear nations. They got the big guns. So I do think that mutually assured destruction, that theory and principle still applies. I don't think we're going to have bombs dropping like crazy in India and China anytime soon. But what like you said is it does make a lot of, especially people in India have less trust of China. We have to remember that India is the largest functioning democracy on the planet with over 1.2 billion people. And just being a democracy in of itself is a threat to China, right? Because China is certainly not a democracy. Like you said, India has a lot in common with China in some ways, but has a lot in common with the United States and others, again, being a democracy. So I do think this might be kind of a catalyst for a shift in their dependency that could have ripple effect in the region. Let's talk a little bit about. I want to talk a little bit about like a brief history of why there was even this tension between India and China in the first place. You kind of touched on it a little bit. But in the 50s, right, when the People's Republic of China was just starting to really burgeon into its own identity, it actually had India regarded China as like a fellow Asian country that was getting out of its imperial control, right? And they were they related with each other. Like, we're not going to be messed around and run around by Europeans anymore. We're going to have our own identity and our own destiny. But a lot of that changed when China and its cultural revolution was trying to basically kill and eliminate the Dalai Lama, and to completely eradicate some of these, Buddhist religions and kind of just get rid of religion as a whole. So the Dalai Lama fled Tibet and took refuge in India, and India had a part in allowing that to happen. That was kind of the first catalyst to where there was some serious conflict. Was again, the Dalai Lama is more than just one man to millions and millions of people. He represents a culture and an identity. So for India to be like, yes, you can take refuge in our country, and it still does. That was a big FU to China. That was in 1959. So fast forward 3 years, as tensions rose with these kind of cultural wars and expansion, both nations were expanding their influence in the region. It actually led to a on-the-ground war, the Sino-Indian War of October and November of 1962. This war actually also took place in this region we're talking about today, in these Himalayan regions. I even read an interesting fact that most of the combat that was fought above 14,000 feet elevation, which is crazy high up.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine lugging like 60 pounds worth of ammo and supplies above 14,000 feet. Anyway, that's just a little fun fact, I guess. But to put in perspective, right, in 1962, there was a real ground conflict with over 1,000 dead on each side, roughly. We don't know the true numbers because of China, but thousands died in this region fighting over this border area in these Himalayas, and then it led to what is it called, the LAC. I'm trying to remember what that stands for. It's like the line of actual control. Right. The line of actual control is basically like for Americans, kind of like the DMZ in North and South Korea, a disputed line, but one where they kind of try and they bulk up their forces on each side and they kind of look at each other and stare at each other and avoid conflict. But for the first time in decades, we've seen now a conflict break out. The reason the conflict broke out recently is because the Chinese have been bolstering their forces with hundreds of vehicles. This is based off of satellite imaging we've gotten from third parties, private companies that have said, hey, we're seeing this weird movement in this region. Hundreds of Chinese vehicles were like on their side, armored personnel carriers. And then India, in response, had maybe 40 to 50 of their own vehicles start to bolster on their side. But what really took it off was a report that Chinese had two forward scouting tents past their side of the LAC, that line of actual control. And that is what, so then in India, in response, set a little scout team to go scout, the Chinese scouts. And then somewhere along this thing of where they said, hey, your tents are on our side. And the Chinese said, well, no, your tents are on our side. Somewhere along that line, this brawl broke out, which again is amazing to me that, sticks and batons is how they fought. I wonder, like you said, I wonder if there was a conscious choice not to use firearms because of escalation. But I don't know. I mean, people dying with batons is pretty crazy. It's hard for me to believe that they wouldn't start shooting, but I don't know enough about combat, I guess. But that's kind of the context of where we're at, right? This region is not just a random spot. This region has been disputed and fought over in an actual war in the 60s.
Right, and thank you very much for putting that out, because I think that was a really nice analysis to give people a good understanding of what's happened, and I think you highlighted well that since the mid 20th century, China and India have kind of gone in totally different courses. And India, like, this is kind of just anecdotal, but during my time working in Europe and traveling, I met a lot of Indian people and a lot of Chinese people. And obviously I'm making a very big blanket statement here, but I've noticed that there is a shared connection I've had with every Indian person I've met that I would not say the same is when I've met Chinese people abroad. And I think it is because there was this Western influence, and India, while China kind of went another direction and had, this cultural revolution, which led to their current communist situation, India does kind of seem like this beacon of openness in that region, right? Like when they split with Pakistan, obviously both countries have taken very different turns, but like India seems more susceptible to the same diseases of Western politics than, say, the ones that Chinese politics are picked up by. Like right now, you see India's kind of taken more of a nationalist, kind of a right-wing populist nationalist. Under Modi, we have seen under his BJP, which is a Hindu nationalist party, you've seen some pretty similar things as anywhere from Boris Johnson to Trump to Bolsonaro. Like there's a lot more similarities with these right-wing nationalists that I have always argued are a symptom of a democracy, whereas China's not really had that same issue. And so what I think we've seen is inside of India, the forces of nationalism at work, and inside of China, kind of this Napoleon complex where, all the experts are saying that China's the next up and coming hegemon. It's going to overtake the United States. But I think we've seen with coronavirus, for example, that I don't know if China's really ready to take the torch yet. They're trying to peddle influence everywhere from 5G to infrastructure projects in the Belt and Road Initiative. But there's no moral standard, there's no image, there's no beacon on the hill that is really appealing to a lot of people. And so it's interesting because I was reading in Al Jazeera and also the U.S. News and World Report, they were talking about this is going to be some tough decisions for both China and India, because India basically, like we've already talked about, is very reliant on China. But this also could be a positive for them because they are going to probably reach out to the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, known informally as the Quad. Right. And it involves India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. And these are all countries that, especially with the pandemic, have been very critical of China. And so, according to Al Jazeera, if the U.S. makes noises in favor of India and strengthens the Quad, this is going to send a message to China that will take aggressive steps and will defend the Western interests. So I think right now we're kind of seeing in some ways a rebuke to China's attempt at kind of being a hegemon. And it's kind of interesting because I think it goes along with what you were talking about, is how they've kind of always been in this clash right? Like I've always seen India as kind of a weird intermediary between Asia, the Asia you think of, and kind of this Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, more going towards the Middle East. And it's kind of interesting because there is a lot of divergences there. And though I think China is in the fault, I think it is interesting to note that there's something called Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. And in 2019, I believe it was August of 2019, India's BJP government, which is under Modi, stripped the state of Kashmir and Jammu of their autonomy after 7 decades. And just for people that don't know, Kashmir is a region that both Pakistan and India claim as their own.
Right.
And they have had violence over this region for decades. And so just last year, Modi's government got rid of Kashmir's autonomous nature. And they were saying this was to unify India, get rid of a separate flag, and make laws that enhance freedom for the entire country. So I see a lot of things happening here, but that Al Jazeera article I mentioned was thinking that in some ways this article might have triggered parts of this because now Indian forces are more focused on their own borders than they were before.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, like, whether or not you agree with the idea of that kind of control over Kashmir, I'm sure people in Kashmir might not be too happy about it, but it's also understandable that a nation would want to have one flag for all of its territory and a political unification in a sense. I think it's just on the ground, right? Is because of that. India was working on, not necessarily freeways, but like trade roads and infrastructure projects in this region. Again, this is a highly mountainous region, very difficult to, move a large amount of goods and people through. So if they are building roads to start doing that effectively, I could see why China got worried about it. Again, this whole area is disputed by, on the western side of the area, it's disputed by Pakistan. On the northeastern side of the area, it's disputed by China. So for this whole area to start to be is heavily disputed for decades, and then for India to start clamping down on control and building infrastructure projects, it probably worried China. And so you're right that I do think it was probably China poking the bear. I think that Quad idea, right? That like talking with Japan and Australia and the United States, I hope that goes well. I really, that's an alliance that I think is good. I don't think Modi is a perfect man. Again, I'm not a Hindu nationalist, but I certainly think that India is closer to preserving the ideals of democracy and freedom and human rights more so than China is. So if we're trying to combat Chinese influence, one, around the globe, but two, especially in Asia, having a strong alliance between large and wealthy partners like the United States, Australia, Japan, and India is incredibly important. And I really hope that the United States response does favor India. When asked about it, though, Trump kind of gave a non-response. He was asked about the incident shortly, before he left his rally in Tulsa. And he said, it's a very tough situation. We're talking to India. We're talking to China. They've got a big problem there. They've come to blows. We'll see what happens. We'll try and help them out. So pretty much a non-answer, or I'm glad they're at least talking. I also know that there's I think probably happening right now, at the time of this recording, I think it is Tuesday in India. And so at the time of this recording, I think there's a summit between China, India, and Russia as a mediary to try and figure some of these things out, which is good. I don't like the idea of Russia being a middleman, but, it's good that things are talking. So this does lead to my point that, I don't think bombs are starting to get dropped. I don't think it's World War III, like the memes you've been seeing on whatever. But I do worry that, based on recent news about Donald Trump and the way he feels about Xi Jinping, I hope he doesn't try and favor China in this dispute. I think India should be where we should put our ally. Like, our ally in this case, in my opinion, is India. And we should try and help India have the stronger say in this dispute. Yeah,
completely. And, like I think like we both said, it makes sense. India is right now, a nationalist country that is trying to look internally and build up their internal issues, much similar to Trump's Make America Great Again. and China's obviously has outward expansion ideas, and obviously those two are going to come into collision. I do agree with you that India should be considered the ally in this area, though I would push back about Modi. I have several Muslim Indian friends who have told me over the years about when Modi was the governor of one of the states of India, and he was involved in a mass purge and violence against Muslim Indians.
Yeah, no
and so
doubt.
he is definitely no good person.
He's no saint. He's no saint. But he's a democratic leader that can be elected out of office, right? He's not. He's not an authoritarian leader.
Right. And that's where I would go, yes, that I actually do not like at all the fact that Russia, China, and India are meeting tomorrow, because I think India is in a weird place where they could be the next Russia or they could be the next United States.
Right.
Like they're like, because Russia, if you think about it, shockingly enough, though they were the epitome of Soviet Russia, communism, they've kind of become a far right, like authoritarianism regime. And I think that India could do that if it's under the wrong people.
Yes.
So we shall see. But I do agree with you that I love the idea of the Quad, right? India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. I think that is a great coalition. And actually, I mean, if you look at it, Japan, Australia, and the U.S. have all been extremely critical towards China involving this pandemic and their handling of it. And that's why I say that I think that everyone thinks China is going to be the next hegemon, but they're not really. China still hasn't won the PR battle. Trump is doing whatever he can to help us lose that PR battle in the United States. But there is still this, light on the hill idea, this American Western dream. And I don't think China's combated it yet. And the more we see these conflicts between China and their neighbors, and we see backing by countries like Australia and the United States, it's only good for the U.S. and it's only bad for China.
Right. Well, again, you're absolutely right. Right. Like the coronavirus is a big PR mess up for China. I mean, we've already talked about how the United States has kind of faulted in its own handling of the coronavirus, but there's valid criticisms over the way China handled the coronavirus. And you're right that the world knows about it, and they've gotten a lot of flack for it, rightly so. This, I think, also adds to that. The fact that you do have videos of Indian citizens burning their Huawei phones, that's not a good look for China.
No.
Now, it's what's next, right? Will India maybe change some of their supply lines? That's a big ask, right? That it's going to take a lot of logistical movement and political movement to do something like that. I mean, I don't think they're going to completely block China out from trade. That'd be economic suicide. But maybe they do. Maybe they do something where it's like, hey, maybe we're going to look to Samsung for the 5G instead of Huawei. That's a big blow, right? That's another PR blow. I hope that, but that's why it's important that we're in contact and talking with India to do something like that. Look, we absolutely want to de-escalate violence. Of course, we don't want any more people, Chinese or Indian, to die. Of course not. But if it does, but what we do want is maybe India starts to move away from Chinese dependence. Maybe India becomes its own source of, influence in the region. It already is, of course. I mean, just the size of the nation. But I mean, maybe other countries like Vietnam and Cambodia and Indonesia look to the Quad for more guidance and economic prospects than they do China. That's the things that I think that, like, this is a moment where the U.S. can come in and be a good guy. And I just hope that we seize it. I hope Trump does that. I want the best.
Yeah, completely. And I think the positive of this is that, like we've talked about, that the BJP inside of India is not a perfect party. They're quite nationalist. Modi's definitely far from perfect. But I would almost think that a closer coupling with like countries like Australia and Japan and the United States could force India to modernize. Yeah. It could force them to have to reshape some of their policies, both economic and social, to deal with this. And of course, a different leader in the United States, both right or left, I would argue would probably be better for this. But unfortunately, we have these cards and we need to play with them. But I do actually, at least from how Trump has acted with India over the last 3 years, he likes Modi. Modi is like the Indian Trump, except much smarter and a better politician, and like in every other way, better at politics. But they do have a lot of similarities when it actually comes to their religious values, their religious politics, etc. And So I think this could be a good time. Like you said, this could be a couple. Obviously, getting rid of China completely is just not feasible. But it'll be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see. But, you know, to be Mr. Negative for a second, though, I mean, China is still building up infrastructure in that region.
Yeah.
Ashley Tellis, she's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, says it looks like China is constructing roads in the valley, and possibly damming the river. So China's there. China's going to be there. So I would imagine we're going to see some more issues. And I just hope, like you said, I mean, the silver lining to this is that they're both nuclear countries that I don't think would really want to escalate this. But economically, I could see it getting ugly before it gets better.
Yeah, I mean, it might be another ripping of the Band-Aid, right? It's going to hurt at first, but eventually it's for the better. I think that any country that is trying to have less dependency on China, it's going to hurt before it gets better. But ultimately, you know, it's the right move. But yeah, I'm with you. You know, it doesn't look good, and certainly China's not one to back down. But I don't think India is either. So I do hope that it doesn't escalate to more violence. Of course, you know, like I said earlier, we don't want any more lives lost in this. I don't think it'll be a full-blown war, but you don't know, man. I mean, skirmishes break out, right? Like this one did. I mean, 20 Indian soldiers were beat to death. That's crazy. That's crazy, and it's sad, and it's a tragedy. So I do hope that it doesn't come to that again. I hope that this summit produces some good results, right? The good thing is you know, as imperfect as they are, you know, Modi is smart. Xi Jinping is smart. I don't think they want a war on their hands. China definitely doesn't want a war on their hands, like we said, after this coronavirus mishap. So I'm hoping for the best. I do see it as a moment where, you know, the geopolitics of Asia can change, and I just hope that the United States seizes that.
Completely agreed. And we'll just have to kind of see. Especially, I'm curious to see how Russia gets involved with this.
Yeah.
Because Russia's allies with both of them. I think Russia sees some very strategic alliances with both of them. And they clearly do not like the U.S. So that will be interesting to me. I'm sure that Putin's going to have some good advice if you're a Russian. Probably not good advice if you're a typical Indian citizen who wants to see change. So... yeah, I don't know. We will see.
And yeah, Russia's always on the sidelines, waiting for their moment to strike. And this seems like it seems like they have the same opinion as me, that they think this could be a good opportunity to gain influence in the region, and they're going to seize it. So I just hope we do it better.
I feel like Russia is not economically strong enough to be, say, like a United States or China.
Sure.
And they don't have the size to be in India, so that's why they're always just kind of the lifeguard on the beach, just waiting for that drowning person to kind of go, all right, I'll bring you in.
Hey,
when I bring
remember
you in,
me?
I got
Yeah.
some things to tell you.
Right.
Well, thank you everybody for listening. Let us know what you think. Is China in the right? Is India in the right? Are they both in the right? I don't know. Is war coming, or is this just another, I guess, kind of speed bump on China's path to hegemony? Please let us know. We're on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Podbean, all those other sites. And just keep telling your friends. It always helps us to keep the word out. Please comment and like. That definitely helps us out as well. And just keep sane during these crazy times. That's all I can say. And wear a mask. So take care. Have a great night.
Thank you all. Take care.